to our inaugural Ed Talk. We conceived of this as a way to celebrate nearly a century and a half of teaching at the University of New Hampshire. As you know, there have been many changes in teaching, from rote memorization to lectures to active learning. And we want to look at UNH's part in innovation and expanding the venues in which learning takes place. And it's in this spirit that I invited Erik Swartz. And again, would like to welcome him. He's like the first, so. And again, there'll be 5 more that'll be running through next April. Erik is a professor and clinical coordinator in the athletic training program in the Department of Kinesiology, which he also chairs because he doesn't have enough to do. So. He's originally from New Jersey. Erik received a Bachelor of Sciences from St. Bonaventure University in 1995. MA through the approved graduate athletic program at Western Michigan University, and completed a PhD in applied biomechanics at the University of Toledo in May 2000. And you started here that fall, as I recall. So, Dr. Swartz's primary research interest involves studying the management of athletes with cervical spine injury, and as he'll tell us later, new ways of training athletes so that they don't injure themselves on the football field. He's published in numerous journals. Are you still on the editorial board of
Yes.
Journal of Athletic Training? Erik received a scholarship to play soccer at St. Bonaventure. He's also played rugby, which I think helped inspire some of the techniques that you'll talk about. And I understand you're a pretty decent fly fisher and
everything's relative.
I've heard that.
Yes.
And his talk is entitled Reducing Head Impacts in American Football, the HuTT Helmetless Tackling Training Technique. So,
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome.
So thank you for doing this, for putting this together, and for inviting me to be a part of it. Even if you don't like football, and how can't you? You're around the Patriots, right? Apparently you just have to be crazy about football. My wife is a Patriots fan. I'm an Eagles fan, so we do have some interesting interactions when we're watching football. But even if you're not passionate about the sport of football, I think that there's some other layers here that maybe you can appreciate, especially with what this is grounded in. The theory that this is grounded in has just a vast array of applications, not just in sport, but in other daily activities. But also, what I hope will be apparent is the integration of athletics and academics. And to have gotten to the point where I am now and kind of tell a story along the way, that it wouldn't have been possible without the cooperation with the football coaching staff and Marty Scarano with athletics. You wouldn't necessarily get that at other institutions. But to have access like that to a head football coach, and them being open to research with their players, right? Their players, our students. You wouldn't necessarily get even access to that, let alone as far as we did in this process. So, if you haven't been following football, then you may not be aware that probably what football's facing, its current crisis that it's facing as a sport, all circles around this problem of head impacts. And the head impacts you can see on all levels of play, every weekend, whether it's in person at a high school game down the road, or youth football, or on TV, collegiate level, professional level. And it's not always just the tackler that's coming in head down and creating head contact or initiating contact with their head. Here you have 2 players on the same team. They're going down to tackle someone else. Friendly fire, some have called it. They run into each other. But look at the posture, look at the technique that they're using, the behavior. This here is not showing up very well. This is a ball carrier. This is a running back or wide receiver He's tucking the football here, clearly going in head first. You could hardly get more parallel to the ground than what he is right there. And on every snap, every play, on all levels from youth to pros, I would put money down that there's an impact, at least one impact on every single play, every single snap, every single game, every single week throughout the season. That's a lot of head impacts. So the obvious consequences, risks associated with this head impact are these catastrophic head or neck injuries that occur, and they still occur. So those are the obvious things, and these are, a lot of these are brain injuries from helmet-to-helmet hits, not necessarily spine injuries, but those still are occurring. But then there's this other risk, this associated risk, is not the acute catastrophic injury, but what is happening on a subconcussive level, it's called, that you have an accumulation of these impacts throughout a career or a lifetime, and what implications does that have later in life? So all of these individuals have passed away and were diagnosed with CTE. 3 of them committed suicide, all right? And so they diagnosed CTE in professional football players, but they've also diagnosed it in 18 and 19-year-old players that haven't even gotten to the pros yet, let alone finish a collegiate career. So there's been some drastic measures. So the Ivy League, again, kind of takes a drastic step, and what they put into place before this current season that we're in is that they're going to eliminate all live tackling in all practices. Now that is logically a way to decrease the risk of head impacts if you just don't have live tackling in practice at all, and that's the measure that they've taken. Whereas what they're also looking at and what some leagues are doing, here's a backup quarterback, went back to his hometown and said, you should eliminate tackling in your youth football leagues. And so some youth football leagues are eliminating tackling. Again, logically makes sense, decrease the risk or chance that heads are going to knock together. Well, when are they going to learn how to tackle? If that's required on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays. Just on Fridays and Saturdays and Sundays? Is that a good idea for them to learn that skill? It's a very important skill to do correctly if you're going to do it safely. So again, the problem is head impacts, and there are multiple strategies that are being, we don't have enough time to go through all of these different strategies, but there's head impact monitoring systems. I use that just in part of the research that I'm doing. You'll see that, but there's other approaches or strategies to try to reduce this risk or address this problem. Improving helmet technology, making helmets better, eliminating tackling, altering game rules, changing where the kickoff is. Kickoff and the kickoff return, that's been a whole, they've been moving the line up and back and more touchbacks, but then, okay, well, let's kick the ball way up high in the air, so it takes long before it comes down, and it doesn't go into the end zone, so there's actually more collisions than they thought there would be. It's really just this puzzle. And all of those attempts are well-intentioned, but do any of them directly address the behavior of going into contact with your head first? They don't. So what is really at the root of the problem? That in American football we have this behavior of initiating contact with the head first. And the major part of the problem, paradoxically, is that they're actually wearing helmets. The helmets are designed to protect them from injury, but it's because they have the helmets on that they can facilitate impact and receive impact to the head because of the protection it affords. So this is called risk compensation or risk homeostasis. And again, in football, the way it's manifested is that the protection affords the ability for them to initiate contact with the head because it doesn't hurt. Okay? Football is depicted. These days, there's a fascination with the equipment that they're wearing, there's an identification with the protective equipment that they're wearing. It's part of now the persona, whether it's the intimidation or the identity of this equipment. And on Fox Sports, this animated Cletus is his name, will come out on breaks and highlights, and he'll dive for a football and hit the ground and sparks will fly and all that kind of crazy stuff. And so it's the message is that he's indestructible. He can do anything because of the equipment that he's wearing. So risk compensation, a little bit more broader definition, is that a countermeasure, like a protective piece of equipment, may have other negative, unintended consequences. They might shift the distribution of an injury or create a change in the behavior of participants. Again, unintended, but that is the side effect of countermeasures. A false sense of security, and that's what is going on here. So let's now step back a little bit even further and actually step up, because we're going to talk about heights. I'm afraid of heights. So to further illustrate this concept of risk and risk compensation, we have this image here. That is not me. I wouldn't even do that. I wouldn't be that person taking that picture. I'm not even sure I would be the person taking the picture. So I perceive risk at the cliff's edge, and I will only go so close, because that's the threshold of risk that I have. Now, people vary. Person one, that maybe would be me, let's say, that's the level of risk associated with that cliff edge. The risk factor is higher than my risk threshold. I will not go closer. This person, though, the risk threshold is not exceeded by the risk factor, and he's okay with it. He'll go up. And so it varies between different people. But then, when it comes to cliffs and the danger of getting too close to the edge, is that, of course, you commonly see railings around cliff edges to prevent people from falling over. People go to the edge, right? Well, risk compensation would say that in this case, where someone fell over the edge, fell over the railing, risk compensation would say that that person would not have gotten hurt if the railing wasn't there, because they would have stood far back enough to not risk falling over the edge. You with me? Mm-hmm. This is risk compensation.
That's very interesting.
So, going back to football, we have an example in the history of football of the manifestation of risk compensation. When it moved from either no helmets or leather covers to helmets that had a hard outer shell and then padding, foam, air bladders on the inside to make them more comfortable, football players began exhibiting the behavior called spear tackling. Tackling with their heads. So in the 50s, 40s, 30s, this behavior was not there. Players did not use their head as a weapon because it would have hurt to use it as a weapon. But once it became more protected, they began to do this. Catastrophic head and neck injuries and fatalities in football spiked. They went up because of this protective countermeasure. It eliminated skull fractures. It eliminated lacerations to the scalp and those kinds of things. But then it changed this behavior, and particularly with quadriplegia and spine injury, that spiked. So it wasn't until 1976 that they made spear tackling illegal, because it wasn't there before that. In the 40s, 30s, 20s, it didn't exist until they started wearing these helmets that had the hard outer shells. So that's a manifestation that we have in the not too far distant past of what helmets can do to behavior in the sport of American football. I don't know if you heard the buzz or saw this game around Cam Newton in a single game. And because of the way he plays and how dynamic of a player he is, He gets tackled a lot. They kind of treat him like a running back or a wide receiver. But there are players that are outright just leading with their heads. So risk compensation would say, well, if they didn't have a helmet on, they wouldn't have adopted this behavior. We wouldn't see this. And it's not just on the professional level, it's on all levels of play. So when children start playing football on the youth level, and really on any level, they always have a helmet on. And this has fascinated me. They're always wearing a helmet. The players on the left, on the high school level, they're just running around a track. Does their head need to be protected? Obviously the answer is no, it doesn't need to be protected. Over here, does it need to be protected? When they're practicing, lines or whatever they're doing, what that's referred to as is a non-contact practice or shells practice. If they just have helmets on, that means that practice is a non-contact or not supposed to be a live tackling practice. Well, why are they wearing helmets if it's a non-contact practice? Well, the belief is, well, just in case they knock heads, we should have a helmet on to help prevent a concussion or something like that. Well, how different is a non-contact football practice from soccer practice, field hockey practice? Any of those where just people are running freely in space, in a sport, distracted with others. How different is that? And in fact, what some research has identified is that what you have here is a comparison of event types, helmets-only practices, full contact practices, games and scrimmages. And they're recording the number of head impacts. I'll talk more a little bit about the technology that's used either in helmets or they attach to players' heads, and you can measure every impact. So you can count the number of impacts and also measure the magnitude of the impacts because it's an acceleration and it's just G's, gravities, so G forces. So not only over 2 seasons, there's 2 seasons at this one college, for those players that were instrumented, there was over 15,000 head impacts. That's almost 30% of the total impacts that they measured. These are non-contact practices. Over 15,000 impacts to the head. Over here is the magnitude. Now, clinically, this isn't a clinically meaningful difference, but the impacts in practices were statistically higher than the impacts in games and scrimmages. The impacts in helmets-only practice, they're supposed to be non-contact. But those impacts were of a higher magnitude than games and scrimmages. So not only are they still impacting heads in these non-contact practices, they're hitting their heads harder. How is that happening? Well, if the only part of your body that is protected is your head, and you know contact with somebody else is imminent, you know it's going to happen. Reflexively, you're going to put the protected body part first. So actually, it would tend to have them actually put their head down to protect themselves because that's the part that's not going to hurt. So not only is this not necessary, it actually may be enhancing head contact in these non-contact practices. There seem to be no light days for football players, is what they said in this article, which is certainly true. So despite that, there's just this explosion of innovation that is, for the most part, centered around how can we make either a better helmet or what can we do to modify the helmet to make it absorb those impacts that we don't want, but make them absorb those impacts to a greater degree. So there's companies that have these add-ons to helmets that are out there that are marketing these. This is actually a clear helmet shell so you can see the technology on the inside. This is somewhat of a departure from traditional helmet foam and bladder systems. These are kind of like air pucks that when they're compressed they release air and then they fill back up. And then this is the most recent inner padding that is still in development that would go on the inside of a helmet. And there's just different helmet designs in themselves. So there's a lot of people who are trying to come up with a better helmet design. This helmet has like 2 different layers. It has an outer shell and an inner shell. And so look at, with this writer, how we kind of put it, well, football, what if we can make a helmet that not only looks totally badass, but look at the words here, anti-concussion design. Now a helmet can't prevent a concussion because the brain, if it accelerates and decelerates inside the skull, you're going to get a concussion. All right? But if you're a parent or a player and you see something being portrayed as an anti-concussion design helmet, well, not only are you going to buy it, but if you're the player, is that going to correct a behavior of head contact initiation, or is it going to enhance it, or encourage it, or perpetuate it? If I'm a player and I'm in an anti-concussion helmet, well, I'll do whatever I want with the helmet, because I'm not going to get a concussion, right? So this is what we're facing with all of this effort towards improving the helmet, is further perpetuating the behavior. At least the last I checked, I'm on an NFL safety committee, and so I often will get just random inquiries from people because they think I'm a buddy with Roger Goodell, and then I'll just all of a sudden make them millionaires. So I get an email, and this is the body of the email. Dr. Swartz, thanks for even opening. I have developed a piece of equipment that will eliminate head and spinal injuries in the game of football. Right there, right? Pick up my phone, call Roger, and tell him we have it. Okay, so the subject line, football helmet of the future. Can't even spell helmet right. This is the state of what's going on out there. And the pursuit of the perfect helmet. And within the past few weeks, yet again, the NFL is out there saying, we're going to fix this. This is a priority to us. Player safety, player health is a priority. We're going to funnel yet another, it's $100 million for research. But $60 million of that is going to go towards technology, in large part, to make a better helmet. And not only that, they think they're going to make position-specific helmets that address the specific needs of each position. What does that even mean? What is the specific need of a certain position? Well, here's a little clue into it. And if the audio works, we will...
The icon of the game. The icon of competition. The icon of athleticism. The icon of men. The icon of the future. The future of football is now.
Now, I know you have goosebumps. Shake it off. And you want to go and play football. Because you can wear a helmet like this. This is an actual helmet. And this helmet is a Speed Flex helmet, and it has a flex system. This part up here is a panel that only attaches to the helmet shell at the top, where you do not see the red outline. The red outline, there's a micrometer, millimeter of space where it does not attach. So if I took a hammer and hit there, it would flex. And yes, it does mitigate the magnitude of the impact because it flexes. But that's exactly where we don't want them using their heads. So now I'm a player who has this flex system. Cool. I just saw that video. I'm going to be as awesome as this guy looks right here. And I can put my head forward because now I'm more protected at the top of my head, the front of my head. So tackling without helmets is possible, and it can be done safely without a helmet in place. Rugby is the best example around the world. They often will wear head covers. These are designed to reduce the chances of cauliflower ear, lacerations, and soft skin types of injuries to the head. Players are not wearing them because they think it's going to help decrease their chance of a concussion. And I played rugby, as Bill alluded to. I played for about 8 years, and I enjoyed tackling. I wouldn't lead with my head because it wasn't protected. We don't do that because our heads aren't protected. There certainly is a risk to that. This is me at a tournament. I didn't know there was a photographer there. Before I got 23 stitches in my lip. 23, I didn't even know you could fit that many in there. It was basically open and they had to do 2 layers of stitches. And it was because I went in to tackle someone and a teammate of mine came in and he went to tackle. It was a friendly fire situation. So while his technique in tackling the person I was clearly going to tackle by myself, not needing help, but his head hit my lip, and so there is a risk to that, right? And it's not to say that rugby doesn't have concussions, because they do. But what rugby doesn't have is this behavior of leading with the head. They tackle a lot more soundly. And they start tackling on the youth levels. It's a natural skill. Running, jumping, throwing, tackling. It's a natural thing that people can do, and they'll do it correctly if their body isn't protected. They'll keep their head out of the way. So removing the helmet entirely from football is not necessarily a good idea the way it's played today, but can players who play football learn to tackle more safely if they practice it without a helmet in place? And would that carry over to helmeted play? So that's the potential solution. And so the central hypothesis around this area of research of mine is that a football player who regularly practices tackling and blocking without a helmet in place is just going to adapt the motor learning and the technique, even in helmeted play, to keep their head out of the way in any of those situations. So that's the central hypothesis. So I have all that, and then I walk up to the field house, and I sit with Coach Mack, and he looks at me, and if you've interacted with him at all, he is a football coach, and he's a good one, and he's an old school coach, and he sounds like an old school coach, and he's out there, and that's exactly what he is, but he's a great guy. We had a couple conversations talking about what I walked you through, a little bit shorter time period, but to his credit, he understood what I was driving at. But now it's, well, how might it affect their performance as a team? So let's say it's this great idea, and yeah, I agree, they could become safer tacklers. But what if all of a sudden my team isn't good anymore? And now we're losing games, and you've affected how my team actually performs. I mean, this is the 2014 stats of how incredible they were, and the awards and accolades that he's earned, and he's done it before, and they're just a perennial power in this league. In other words, he didn't need me, really, for anything, but, again, to give him credit, and also with recent history with the team, they've had some players who have had to stop playing football because of consistent, persistent problems with concussions. So he was acutely sensitive to the issue, and of course, just surrounding the sport for a couple decades now, this has been on the forefront. So again, give him a ton of credit for being open to the dialogue in the first place, and then working with me patiently to figure out a way to make it work in their program. Because it's one thing to ask their players to maybe do a different concussion assessment or something, and maybe it's a preseason thing, and they do a baseline test, and sure, the players can do this because it's outside of my contact time with them. But literally what I was asking for was an intervention, which I'll describe, in the in-season practices and games, by the way. So that was a lot for him to risk, actually. So give him a ton of credit. So these pictures here are from the first day of the intervention for the Helmetless Tackling Training Program, the HuTT program. And this started in 2014, 2-year study. So it finished last year. So this year I'm not doing data collection with the team, but it was a 2-year study. And what Coach Mack and his coaches helped me with was designing this helmetless tackling training program to take my concept from rugby and make it more applicable to football and to some of the things that they were already doing. So it was a little bit more seamless into what they were already doing, but still getting what I wanted to try to test and study as far as the intervention. So they would do the, and this isn't playing correctly, it's actually in slow motion, which maybe looks better. This is just an example of one of the drills. And you clearly see that players are going into contact with each other without helmets on, without shoulder pads on. Coach wanted to make sure he had some kind of protection there, so they would hold the padded shields. But it's really what's important is these reps that these players are going through without helmets and shoulder pads on. And we had about 10 different drills that they would do to try and simulate more of the different demands during play. And throughout the entire season, all of the players that agreed to be subjects, which they were randomized to either a treatment group or a control group, so I'm running a randomized prospective study, that the players would come in and they would get a head impact sensor behind their ear applied. We had tremendous participation with kinesiology students, athletic training students primarily. They just love this enhancement to their clinical experience of being involved in the research and the data collection. And the players are coming through before every practice and every game. And then come back into the athletic training room when it was over, if they remembered, and took the sensor off and left it for us, and then we would charge it and put it back on the next day. And we're collecting every impact that they're sustaining in practices and games. So every exposure or every possibility that they may have to an impact, we want to capture. So with these sensors, what that depicts is, here's a representation of one player in one exposure, one practice, 43 impacts. Not all of them are necessarily true impacts because it is an accelerometer and it's just picking up accelerations. So it has a way to filter out false impacts from true impacts. But it records the impact of where it is on the head, the magnitude of the impact, and that's what you're seeing here is the linear acceleration. So this peak linear acceleration is shown here is a very low 14G impact. Very low for football. Fighter jet pilots, they experience like 7G or 8G of force when they're moving at like the speed of sound. We've measured impacts as high as 156 Gs of force in this population. So as far as a randomized controlled trial is concerned, this is exactly what you want to see. Here's our control group. 14 impacts per exposure throughout the course of the season. The treatment group started off the same as the control group. That means your randomization worked. And then throughout the course of the season, we think, because participating in the HuTT program, the helmetless tackling drills, their impacts decreased significantly by the end of the season. So that, in the first season, is what we saw. We were able to get a quick technical note publication out in the Journal of Athletic Training on the first year results. We've analyzed year 2. We lost some subjects to a trip. We actually lost 10 subjects. So when you start with 50, that's a big hit. So we lost a little bit of power there. Our head impact frequency did go down, but when we control by that exposure, basically standardized by the exposures, that difference went away. But what we've done because of that and because of again, trying to get more funding to support this work, is that the Head Health Challenge grant that we received allowed us to go out and do this on the high school level in the Seacoast area in southern New Hampshire. And so we had 4 high schools, 5 teams initially, because one high school had both a freshman and then sophomore juniors enroll in the study. And we started off with over 170 subjects. And so we have high schools around the University of New Hampshire that are doing the HuTT program. And we changed the prescription for them, the intervention, because these are different people. This is a different population. They're not done growing yet. These are 14, 15, 16-year-olds. Here, when we study UNH, not only do we have 18-year-old, 19, 20, 21, but they're elite athletes. Most of these players won't even get to Division I football, let alone college football. So what we have our players doing here at UNH to get the benefit that we hope that they will get, the dose of the intervention may not be the same or may not be appropriate to do at the younger age levels. So we have a lot of work to do in this. It's gotten some media attention. But going along that same vein as far as the dose and the prescription, is that with over-the-counter medications, prescription medications, those go through human randomized controlled trials so that we can understand, are there any side effects, are there any this and that, but on a children's Advil bottle, look at all the levels that even that has according to age and weight. So the intervention, the dose that would be required for like an 8-year-old may be different from a 20-year-old or a 21-year-old. And so ultimately, this research will continue and needs to continue, not only to continue to demonstrate effects on like the collegiate level. We need to do more research on the collegiate level with a higher sample size. High school level, we need to have widespread reinforcement, validation of it, but also across the different age levels and experience levels. So we're trying to get funding for the youth level. We've been in contact with the Seacoast Junior Football League, which is in the area. But we're trying to get NIH funding and to support that continued work. So that's it. And my kids do not play.
Because they don't want to, or because you don't let them?
I don't let them. Caleb would play. Caleb he's my 7-year-old. This is a few years ago. They find helmets in the back of my car.
It's just super safe.
Avery's 9, Caleb's 7. He would want to. He likes to tackle and have rough and tumble play. But he can play rugby. He actually already did. There's a touch rugby league occasionally in the area, so they both did like an 8-week touch rugby rec leagues.
I suspect that rugby players do not play at the same speed that American football players play at. I mean, is that accurate because of the helmet?
The accelerations and decelerations that you'll see, or maybe to put it as the impact velocities that you'll see in football, probably would be higher because it's, to put it plainly, it's a free-for-all.
Yeah.
You can block it almost anyone. You can tackle anyone. I mean, you didn't have to have the ball. I mean, you can tackle something, you can block. I mean, there's holding penalties and interference and those kinds of things. But just because of the unpredictability of it, that the impact velocities, I would agree, will probably tend to be higher. And that's because in contrast to rugby is where the ball is, controls where the line of scrimmage is. And so rugby is a lot just anterior, posterior. Not really side to side, it's not, it's just kind of like boom, 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 boom. So it's really just front and back. And it's sustained. It's a full, I don't know what the Olympic level is, it's probably 40 minutes. And those players are both offense and defensive players. And it's sustained the entire time. Whereas in football, they go out for 7 seconds, 3 times. You know, they stop the offense, they come off and take a break for like 5 minutes. And then the offense, you know, the offensive players go out. So it's sustained over that. So I think that also maybe downgrades it a little bit. But I think if you just watch some highlights in rugby, and once they get the ball like spun out to the sides, to the wing, they're moving pretty quick. And so impacts there can be as probably just as vicious as in football. There's likely just not as many of them that are to that degree.
I think it's interesting, the awareness that you're raising around this is fascinating. It's funny, I'm not a huge football fan, but you know, I've watched over the years and I think, you know, they used to kind of like pat each other on the butt when something good happened, and now they butt heads.
Oh yeah.
And I'm just thinking, like, there's a piece to that that I'm curious about. Like, is that some sort of bonding thing?
So a couple.
Like, what is that all about?
They're like cats.
A couple little just funny anecdotes about that is that, so the first game that we collected was against Toledo. And I traveled to a lot of the away games myself, especially in the first year to make sure the data collection was going well, but then I would send an extra student if I couldn't make the trip. And I'm looking at the data after the game, and all the impacts are time-stamped. And I know the start and end time of the game. Well, I'm seeing these players that have impacts before the start of the game. And I grab one and I'm like, what is going on? You guys are headbutting each other, aren't you? You get psyched up.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, well, yeah. And they're doing it.
Yeah.
So then the question was, well, from a research perspective, do we kick those impacts out or do we keep them in our analysis?
Oh man, that's tough.
Well, it's part of football.
Right.
It's part of the football experience.
Right.
And knocking each other on the heads and stuff, if that's an impact in football, then we kept it in.
Well, it just ties so closely to what you were saying about the helmet and this perception that it's safe because I've got it, and then it creates this behavior
Yes.
that, you know.
Yeah. So one of the other little tricks that I do if I start a talk, and I didn't do it with this group because I wasn't sure, but what I say is I say turn to the person next to you and headbutt. Right? And everybody, and especially if I have students, if I have a large group of like, 500 people or something, and they're all sitting close together, I love that one because then everybody's like they raise their eyebrows. I'm like, well, why wouldn't you do it? And they're like, well, because it'll hurt. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It doesn't hurt to do that. Therefore, it doesn't hurt to do this in football.
Right.
And those vicious helmet-to-helmet hits that you're seeing, like Cam Newton gets just destroyed. I mean, his skull would fracture if he doesn't have the helmet on it. And I'm sure it hurts, especially the third or fourth time, to a certain degree. And if you've had a concussion before, sure, there's some pain, some aching there. But the player that delivered the blow, it didn't hurt at all. I mean, it's just... we often see them destroy somebody with a helmet-to-helmet hit. The player goes unconscious, fumbles the ball, and the other team is celebrating because they fumbled the ball and they just recovered it, including the guy that delivered the vicious hit. It's not always like that. Sometimes they're at just as much risk themselves, especially with a spine injury if they deal with that.
I'm curious about the undergraduate research piece, how you orchestrate that. Do you have some teaching assistants who then teach a cadre of students, or how do you orchestrate the training and the supervision?
So with the UNH study, and because I'm in athletic training, and our students do clinical experiences, we already had 7 or 8 students assigned to football. And so in 2014, in the preseason, leading up to the preseason, I get with the group I tell them what's going on, would love to have their involvement in it on a day-to-day basis. And they were all excited about it because, again, it just enhances their clinical experience because they get to be involved in the research. And then it was a matter of training them that year and then slowly being more comfortable about not going to practices myself to make sure that it was being carried out correctly. But eventually they were able to do it as a group. And so like each day I would say that out of the 7 of them, I would say, well, each day you have to go through a rotation. Who's the HuTT boss? I forget what I termed it. Somebody's the HuTT boss, and you got to make sure that you follow this list of priorities for the day, for pre-practice, during practice, after practice. And they would just rotate that responsibility. So once I had them trained, then that was great. So then what was helpful in the